Hi, and welcome to Palpable Observations. This is McKay Muhlstein, and I have a few different guests for us today. We have Dr. Kristofsky, who was a PhD student at Harvard, studying under multiple different sources, and he's here to talk to us today about a few different herbs and spices that have been talked about recently in other media. We also have some other special guests here today, but Dr. Kristofsky, please introduce yourself.
Hey, thank you for having me on.
No
I'm
problem.
very pleased to be here.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about some of the work you've done.
Well, there's been several years on the job, but in recent years I've spent plenty of time off the coast of Maine, as has some of my contemporaries.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm excited to hear about some of your research, but first, before we really dive in, I wanted to talk a little bit about our sponsors. We have Tommy Bahama chairs, the beach chairs. They're here for us, and you can get those anywhere, especially Costco. We also have the best yet of, I'm trying to read the name here.
Charcoal briquettes.
Yes, thank you, Professor. Charcoal briquettes. We'll have Professor here in Mayhem come in soon, but help me with that. Anyway, Dr. Kristofsky, I want to hear more about your travels to off the coast of Maine.
Yes, there were several excursions, one that I would like to highlight in particular.
Okay.
But I've been there probably close to 24 times in the past decade.
Wow.
But there was a couple extensive sessions that are troubling me years later.
Sounds like quite a bit of drama. What happened?
Yes, I was studying under Dr. Schmuelstein as a grad student, a PhD student, and there were several things I'd like to refute about his recent claims.
Okay, well, Dr. Schmuelstein is very popular in science right now, and he's had a lot of good stuff about him, but we've heard from Dr. Kristofsky that he may not be everything that has been painted of him.
Yes, I guess we'll just cut to the chase. There was some illegal doings on the island of Schmal.
Illegal?
Illegal and somewhat deceiving that we must discuss.
Please, continue onward, and we'll also have Professor Mayhem chime in. Professor, maybe you should also introduce yourself.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me on the podcast. I am Professor Mayhem. Yeah, what else do you want to know about me?
Well, I'd love to hear how all of your research connects into this as well.
Well, I've never been to the island of Schmal.
Okay.
I've never even met anyone from Maine, actually. But I do know a little bit about the psychological effects and uses of common kitchen spices.
Okay.
So,
well, I feel like that would be very valuable insight.
I hope so.
As we go forward.
Yeah.
To chime in here, sorry if I'm out of order,
No,
but
please go ahead.
there is one irrefutable fact here that must be addressed right from the beginning.
Okay.
There's been talk of on the island of Schmal being a haven for parsley addicts, or whatever you would call it.
Yeah.
And if anyone with a relatively firm mind and clear countenance would observe, it wasn't parsley at all.
Really?
Yeah.
What would you claim it to be?
I think definitely it was a rare form of rosemary. Rosemary is consumed all over the world now, and it was a spectacular observation we made there. But after several years of psychedelic drugs and other influences, I'm surprised Dr. Schmuelstein at all was even able to come to a conclusion of anything at all.
So I'm curious then, how could somebody confuse the two? I'm sure you're very aware and very versed in a lot of these different things, of course. Like the professor here has seen all sorts of different spices. How could you see the difference? Or how could he overlook the difference, Dr. Schmuelstein?
If you spend the majority of our month-long excursion hopped up on drugs, how else could you make a conclusion?
And were you yourself as well partaking of the drugs?
I would like to say I was of a firm mind, and I did not take the drugs. I was there for serious scientific purposes.
Can I chime in here?
Please, go ahead, Professor.
I just want to make a point that even small amounts of these aromatic herbs can have a little bit of an effect on a person psychologically. Maybe you can't call them high, maybe you can't call them tripping, but even small amounts can have effect on you. And especially in very concentrated doses, even the most common of aromatic and tasteful herbs can really affect a person's mind.
I've heard it's all about cultivation and also how it's harvested. Because, of course, the stuff that we have in our kitchens wouldn't have the same effect, correct?
I think that depends on... It does depend on how it's harvested, but it also depends a lot on how you are using it in your cooking, how are you using it in other ways.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So, Dr. Kristofsky, if there's anything that you could say to appropriate audiences that are listening, that are also enthusiasts of such things, what would you say or warn them about false claims?
Well, there's many consequences of taking the wrong herbs and using them in the wrong context.
True.
One might forget basic functions, brushing one's teeth, putting on the right pair of pants in the morning.
And did you see such things with other people on this trip?
Much more than that. Some people that will go unnamed. Actually, I'll just name it. Dr. Schmielstein. He was running around like a barbarian on this island, and he claimed that it was his island when we were amidst all the locals.
Well, that's quite appalling.
Very unprofessional. More appalling than that was how he was running around, mostly naked, the entire trip.
If I may, Professor Mayhem here, I just wanted to point out that perhaps that if Professor or Dr. Schmielstein was behaving this way, he might have been completely unaware of it. The way that these substances can affect one's brain can cause you to not even realize that you're acting in a strange or different way. It might seem totally normal to you, and this could really affect the conclusions that are brought out of these so-called studies.
Well, that's very interesting. That means this could be happening all over the world and no one would know.
Yeah, it's very difficult to determine whether this is happening or not.
Of course, except from an outside view, such as Dr. Kristofsky has so valuably shown us.
Well, I keep cutting to the chase here, but there was really some serious problems that started even before we left the office. He offered several of us grad students some of these inhibitors, and within minutes he was humming the song. Are you familiar with Green Onions? It's an early 60s instrumental. It has no words, but Professor Schmielstein had the words all wrung out, and he wouldn't quit singing them all the way to Maine.
I don't think I'm aware of this song, but it sounds quite unprofessional, like I said.
Yes, but...
quite a scandal, I'd even say.
Yes?
Well, if I may challenge you a little bit, I think that you might not be as innocent as you think. Like I said, these things can affect you without you even knowing it. I'd like you to join me imagining walking into an Italian restaurant. Think about the smells and the senses that you're feeling. Even those senses that you're feeling kind of give you a certain feeling of Italian food, of the certain kind of lifestyle. Same thing if you go to a Mexican taco truck, you get a whole totally different experience.
Very true.
Even in these small doses of smelling food from afar away, these start to affect your mind.
Right. Yes.
And so what I'm getting at is perhaps even you on this trip, before the trip, perhaps you had been affected by these substances without you knowing it as well. So how are we supposed to know that what you're saying is true and credible?
Well, excuse me, Professor. You weren't there, were you? There were several incidents. Well, I'll just tell you what it felt like on the island of Samal, and you can tell me whether my judgment sounds correct. When you walked off the boat onto the island, it smelled like rosemary French fries. And that was a smell that permeated the entire trip. Now, if you got home and your clothes smelled like parsley, you made a wrong judgment.
That is a very good observation, I would say.
Yes, but I did not take any of these substances the entire trip, and I kept my wits about me.
Well, there you have it, my friends. It is quite a scandal, as we don't often see in this type of society of scientists. But as we follow along, hopefully we'll still continue to give you updates. We will have hopefully a second opinion from a few other students on this trip.
Let's talk about a little bit about the harvesting of the rosemary. We skipped that.
Sure. We do have a little bit more time.
There was mention of a 90% mortality rate.
Oh, yes.
And that was grossly underestimated. It was close to 92%, 92.5 to be exact. And a miscalculation of those proportions might make you reach the wrong conclusions about the island.
So to be clear, this is the harvesters themselves, correct?
Yes, 92.5% mortality rate.
Well, that's quite staggering. I have to say, those are numbers to be reckoned with.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the process and how these people ended up dying?
Yes, please.
Yes, well, as we know, there's several cliffs on the island, but most of the deaths weren't actually during the climbing. And that's one fact that often goes unnoticed. People make quick assumptions about the cliffs and the climbing, yes.
What was the cause, if you could say?
Well...
if it's not too gruesome.
Yes, for our viewers.
It is not gruesome. There's several illnesses that took hold of the men. And I guess I must divulge. Let me take one step back and we can talk about a tribe of Native Americans on the west coast of California that will put this into context. In the middle 1860s, there was a man by the name of Ishi. And Ishi emerged into Western culture with several of his native healing rituals intact. So he would often detail the problems with Western culture, and he described two things that would make men sick. He said, spending too much time indoors and spending much too much time around women during menstruation. And now, during those times, there was huts set aside for women during the menstruational period, and that's something that we observed on the island of Samal. And during this unique period of time, they moved away from using these buildings for the women, and the men were exposed, so to say, to the women during these times, and that's enough to make any man sick.
Well then, that's definitely gone unnoticed.
Yes, and that's something
research.
Totally forgotten by Schmielstein himself, because he was all too eager to spend time around the women all hours of the day and night.
If I remember correctly from Dr. Schmielstein's observations on the island of Schmal, he's claimed that the group of people who were harvesting were all men. Are you saying that there were women present during the harvesting, or were there just women on the island? What can you tell us about that?
Yes, there's, of course, any population with any successful colony would have women, of course. You have to propagate the species, and so yes, the women weren't part of the harvesting, but they were a part of daily life. And to be a part of daily life during this menstruational period would lead one man to sickness.
Wow. Well, that is definitely quite a bit.
And so imagine this. The men are sick and weary on their way to harvest the rosemary, and that extra effort might have just been enough.
Especially in their old age.
Yes, and you add in the exposure to the elements I described earlier, and there we go. That's a recipe for a 92.5% mortality rate.
And these things you found yourself, Doctor.
Yes, I found myself, and like I said, you can use a cross-cultural reference to the Yana tribe in Northern California to confirm the theory.
I would say very confirmed.
Yes.
Well, do you have any closing remarks, both of you?
Yes, that Schmielstein needs to rot in hell. I hate him. Oh, excuse me. That was a bit strong. I think he just needs to watch his conclusions and not every popular scientist is just validated for whatever he says. You must do research. You must. Yes, I hated him out there on that trip.
That is very valuable
I
advice.
continue to hate him now.
Professor?
Yeah, I'd just like to weigh in here. Probably one thing that's important to remember is that just like these herbs and spices we're talking about can affect you psychologically, one's emotions can also affect your view of another person and their scientific findings. So just keep that in mind as you continue to listen to these different podcasts and these different scientists. Yeah, that's all I'd have to say.
Keep a very open mind. That is a great way to look at it, Professor.
Yes, thank you.
Well, thank you to Dr. Kristofsky and Professor Mayhem. I think this was very enlightening. And thank you again to our sponsors. We hope you guys continue listening to us. And we're signing off.